What does it mean to be Presbyterian? Many of us in the tradition have a kind of vague understanding, but if pushed for a definitive answer, would stumble around a bit. Those who stand outside the tradition might also have a vague notion, but would be even harder pressed to give a definitive answer. So what is it that makes a Presbyterian a Presbyterian? Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Tuesday, September 11th, 2024. Some of you will remember the 1990s sitcom Murphy Brown. The plot was based on the cast and crew of a 60 Minutes style news magazine starring the tough-as-nails Murphy Brown, who was surrounded by a cast of both on-air personalities and production crew. One of the characters was Jim Dial, played by Charles Kimbrough. The character of Jim Dial is the news anchor who does straight-up news reporting. I mention him because there were occasional mentions that Jim was a Presbyterian, a fact that was underlined by his stiff, uptight demeanor. For many people, that's what a Presbyterian is, a stiff, humorless person, one of God's so-called frozen chosen. Historically, there has been some warrant for this kind of caricature, but this characterization doesn't really tell the whole story. It's much more complex than a simple caricature. So here's the rub. There are lots of flavors of Presbyterians. We happen to belong to one of the largest Presbyterian denominations in the world, and certainly the largest one in the United States. But why are there other Presbyterian denominations? If you're a Presbyterian, then you're a Presbyterian, right? Well, not so much. Which points to one important feature of being Presbyterian, both for better and for worse, and that is, Presbyterians are defined by doctrine. Other Christian traditions are held together by other factors. Catholics and Episcopalians, for example, tend to be bound together by a combination of their prayer books and by their form of government, the episcopate. They arguably have a broader base of theological perspectives nested within them, but since they are bound by prayer book and episcopate, they have a common bond that usually transcends theological differences. Presbyterians, by contrast, are bound by theology. As a result, when major theological divisions emerge in the life of the church, Presbyterians are prone to divide. There have been efforts throughout the generations to mitigate this penchant for dividing, but most of these efforts have not been able to hold a bunch of fractious Presbyterians together when their beliefs diverge. There have been divisions over slavery, race, the role of women in the church and women's ordination, and most recently the marriage and ordination of gays and lesbians. At every one of these controversies, a minority decided that enough was enough, and they split off from the main denomination and usually formed a new one. The Orthodox Presbyterian Church, the Presbyterian Church in America, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, and most recently the Evangelical Covenant Order of Presbyterians. These are just the most recent and most well-known of these divisions. And none of these divisions is older than 100 years. So one of the first things to know about being Presbyterian is that theology is important, doctrine is important. Which begs the question, what doctrines are important? It would be impossible to draw up a list of doctrines all Presbyterians could agree upon, but among the most widely cited, perhaps the most important, is what we call the absolute sovereignty of God. That doesn't sound like much, but it's actually deeply important to who we are. It speaks to the fact that while there are many forces at play in the world, above them all is the God who created the universe and who still takes an active role in human history. Not in such a way that you can always point to this or that event and say definitively that God caused it to happen. Instead, it's a belief that in the end, no event is so tragic that God cannot take it and redeem it. It doesn't make the tragic any less tragic, and it certainly doesn't make God the author of the tragedy. Rather, it's the belief that God is constantly nudging human history to bend to his ultimate will. It also means for us that there is no part of human life that lies outside the scope of God's concern. You name it: social life, national life, family life, economic life, political life. It's all part of God's created order, and therefore part of God's concern. It is why, for example, the British King George III, who reigned during the American Revolution, would call that revolution that Presbyterian revolt. For perhaps more than any other single religious group, Presbyterians were driving forces in that revolution. Not the only ones, of course, but prominent ones. For example, the only clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence was John Witherspoon, a Scottish Presbyterian transplant to America, who was serving then as the president of what is now Princeton University, then a Presbyterian school. So, what else does it mean to be a Presbyterian? We'll find out a little bit more tomorrow and the rest of this week. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.